Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 26th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being, They May All Be Regarded as Political Acts, that is, wars. The text follows, returning now to the main subject, although it is true that in one kind of war the political element seems almost to disappear, whilst in another kind it occupies a very prominent place, we may still affirm that the one is as political as the other. For if we regard the state policy as the intelligence of the personified state, then amongst all the constellations in the political sky whose movements it has to compute, those must be included which arise when the nature of its relations imposes the necessity of a great war. It is only if we understand by policy not a true appreciation of affairs in general, but the conventional conception of a cautious, subtle, also dishonest craftiness, averse from violence, that the latter kind of war may belong more to policy than the first. So, short paragraph this time, nevertheless very important as all things in Von Clausewitz. And in fact, in this paragraph we take a look substantially at war and policy as, let's say, a step forward in depth to the matter, especially observing politics in this sense as how it, what it really is and why it is not. It is substantially different in its nature from war, but it's still something that fundamentally is seeking similar aims. Actually, war in itself, violence in itself, is only an instrument, right? But in here, Von Clausewitz is showing that policy doesn't have less harmful objectives than what the military ones that are still driven by policy practically are. And he introduces the topic, talking actually about these two ideal and not better identifiable, if not in relative terms, wars differing in their nature substantially, differing only in appearance actually, because as you understand, the paragraph is stating that all wars are political acts themselves. But if you remember in the previous paragraphs, the previous paragraph proper, the 25th, Von Clausewitz was saying, okay, that there are certain wars that from our subjective perspective, it's not explicitating it, but it's actually pretty clear in the way he addresses it. He says, they may look kind of more or less political, or more or less military, conversely. What does that mean? Paraphrasing a little bit what we read last time, is that there are wars into which the intervention of policy is kind of more evident, it's more apparent. I mean, there are certain events to which policy is kind of there apparently all the time, in substantial ways. Others that are kind of more, that appear at least as something more military, right? It's really a pure clash, like it seems like that, and war just sends, the policy just sends the mandate, and the military takes basically takes notice and goes ahead. But as we have already said, this is not true. Fundamentally, that's just a sort of an illusion. It's something only true in appearance, let's say, because obviously war has this different potential, let's say, in the in its tendency towards the absolutes, the abstracts and absolutes of war for what it should be, like an act of violence in the clash between these two strugglers. But at the same time, it's always controlled and modified by policy, and at all times, and not just in one moment or another that it's intermittent. It's always controlled by that, because fundamentally whoever is on a battlefield is in some way is not an automaton, right? It's not, and even robots today that we can use obviously are still programmed for reasons that and manned and let's say employed for reasons that go beyond the strictly military ones, so that you decide to employ them whether or not in actual fact. Stupid example on artificial intelligence and other stuff like that, but it's still the point, because people believe that, I don't know, at a certain point war will be all automatized, right, and there won't be any problem to. No, that won't happen. I mean, it's really fantasy fiction, and it takes away the human element, and it's a very, by the way, okay, let's not digress on this, but just always bear in mind that it's extremely important to have this mental attitude towards war. I mean, not to fall into the trap of pretending that war is something that you can concentrate on a field, or that basically stays away of your it's out of your very far, and nothing interferes basically of it into your affairs, and that you basically fight war as if it was, just a daily, not a series of affairs, Von Clausewitz says. Things, now we will have time to explain this more in detail. Now I don't want to spoiler much, but that's definitely things we have already addressed in part, especially in this series. So, but at the end of the day, what I was saying is that there is this difference in potential, so that there are, of course, wars that are kind of more violent, more therefore more militarily oriented, where the war is more intensely fought and more forces are drawn into it, and therefore less space is left to policy, let's say in proportionally, but always, policy is always controlling that. And even though the what happens in wars naturally can backfire to the political actor, to the political entity that is normally happening, because there is someone striking back, not because at a certain point the military basically starts going on by itself as a pure destructive force. Of course, the military can have political reasons to do it, and that's in fact where politics is always there, right? And these things like coups and revolutions can also start, but it's always about policy. Policy never detaches it from war. And let's remember it: war is exclusively and completely and wholly and totally an instrument of policy, nothing else. That is, it's not important, throwing a punch, but the reasons why you throw that punch. And this is kind of evident, like even in if you look from a legal perspective, we don't look at the instruments. We look at I mean, of course, we look also at the instruments and how things are carried out, what you think to achieve with those instruments, because going to war and using violence on such a large scale is definitely not very light thing you do lightheartedly, let's say, but it's still the most important aspect of it is still the motives, the move that stays behind that. So this is let's say the basic assumption that you will always to bear in mind when reading von Clausewitz, because otherwise you can't go very far ahead with it. And von Clausewitz is dedicating all these opening paragraphs of the first chapter exactly to set this as very clearly, and that's why he's taking so much time insisting on these aspects that are relatively theoretical still, and they do not. I mean, they're always true. They're always very real in the sense that they belong even into the theory, to reality for how it moves. But then they're still relatively abstract. They're not applied now through examples, for instance. to real events and how they do. And von Clausewitz here is only describing this dynamics and how they normally happen. Or better, let's forget about my poor explanation capabilities, but he simply tells you how they work, because this is what is interesting in absolute. So going in to the text, Prober says, returning now to the main subject, although it is true that in one kind of war the political element seems almost to disappear, whilst in another kind it occupies a very prominent place, we may still affirm that the one is as political as the other. So it is what we just said in the premise. Even though there are in one kind of war here, that von Clausewitz has not really, as in the previous paragraph, has not set really, the idea that there is a category of war, right? Here, the kind of war von Clausewitz is talking about is a type of war that you can subjectively and arbitrarily and relativistically even identify, because it's kind of less, and you can do that comparing all wars, because they're all different in this sense, because the political element seems stronger, or the strictly military one seems to disappear, and vice versa. But here von Clausewitz is telling you it doesn't change. It's just in appearance. Every war is essentially a political act, and it never changes. You can't come out of there. That's the real point. And he explains why. For if we regard the state policy as the intelligence of the personified state, then amongst all the constellations in the political sky whose movements it has to compute, those must be included which arise when the nature of its relations imposes the necessity of a great war. So, beautiful metaphor that Clausewitz here takes from astronomy, let's say, and it is pretty effective because it makes you understand the complexity of this political sky by, in fact, comparing it to the real one, to all the various constellations, the movements of the planets, etc. Its complexity is something it's very also difficult to keep track of. But this is a metaphor. Naturally, war is way more complicated than a calculation like that, unless you don't start considering that the stars effectively are so many. So, but this is a detail now. That the point he gets to is that policy is always the one that, on base of the contingencies, decides whether to go to war or not. Why? Because here state policy is regarded as the thinking brain of the personified state. In the Clausewitzian triad, you know that there is people, state, military, etc. So the state, in this sense, and therefore the government, let's say better, so the eminently political organism is the one that fundamentally is brought to reason out what's the best choice that has to be taken, that has to direct, that has to organize, that has to declare, in fact, wars, and to decide whether that's the reasonable thing to do. This is very important to understand, because you may say, oh well, but my politicians seem to be so dumb. Yeah, and effectively as individuals they may as well be, and they are most of the times, as a matter of fact, unfortunately. But at the same time, in human institutions of governments, etc., the whole objective is the one of figuring out what needs to be done, to think it through low. Let's say, also from strict economical perspectives, or broader economical perspectives, actually, from even thinking it militarily speaking, meaning that the military obviously has a say in political affairs that the policy, however, listens to, and in fact to give a mandate to the military. Of course, sometimes states are, if you take an absolute monarchy, of course that will kind of do the same thing, but even in there, both things at the same time, but even in there is a strict differentiation between the reasoning and decisional moment and the one in which war is effectively waged, right? So that there is still a decision to make, and whichever governmental institution you're thinking of historically, there is always someone that is thinking that out, so that the military doesn't go nuts by itself just for the sake of shedding blood, and there is always a political mandate, even in mutinies, and even in everything that eventually brings to the military action, to the act of violence as war is. So the political institutions embody this intellectual element of society, an intellectual face of society, which doesn't mean that policy is pure reason, but definitely it's the one that calculates things more rationally than, say, compared to the masses, and compared even to the let's say the same taste for gambling that von Clausewitz think that the military effectively has in itself. I mean, as a risk, as the idea that there are people voted to this great gamble that is to go there on a battlefield, and definitely knowing how to work things out, but still knowing that they can effectively be killed, and therefore having this kind of taste for that terrible game that war effectively is. Because let's remember it, war is a game. One of the Clausewitzian definitions, war is a game, and it is effectively a game. And we think that a game has to be just something silly or childish. Probably is not a very intelligent person himself as well, who thinks that this definition is just to say that the war is kind of a child's play, like in this sense, which is not, because von Clausewitz has defined that also as an extremely serious matter, and therefore a very serious game. And I think it doesn't require explanations in itself. So yeah, this thing of the constellations basically means that there are so many factors that the political world has to take into consideration in order to take that decision. That, however, these are remain in any case the ones that bring to the decision here that says it imposes the necessity of a great war. And this is important because von Clausewitz is explaining that wars occur in here for the movements of the constellations of the political sky, when the nature of its relations impose, so that war is not really here von Clausewitz is not making a deterministic point. It's not saying that there are certain moments into which you just have to go to war mandatorily. Von Clausewitz is a great believer in free will, in this sense, or at least he is a possibilist. He doesn't address into this real world the necessity of war for itself, but on the contrary, he advocates for the prudence in many ways, but also in fact the intelligence to understand whether you have to wage war or not, because on these decisions depend the fate of entire countries, etc. So, and always remember that von Clausewitz is talking from a perspective of someone who would not just fought throughout all the Napoleonic Wars, but also saw his country defeated, actually crushed, and invaded and occupied, and had to fight it for its liberation, at least from their perspective. So it's the Vom Kriege is being written exactly for this purpose of showing how you don't just have to tend toward an extreme when it comes to political decision, even in terms for what concerns the use of violence, etc. But you will always have to think it through whether it's the best option to do or the worst, or as it often happens, it's kind of in the middle. Nobody can really say, even for the same nature of war that we have analyzed in these first paragraphs, how effectively the outcome of the same military enterprise will be. This can happen also politically speaking, so that's not the point, but war has this kind of higher potential, this higher attractiveness, because it can solve things kind of more radically, but at the same time it also can get out of hand and cause massive disasters and backfire, etc. So von Clausewitz is definitely not a warmonger. He's also not a militarist. He's simply telling you that, look, when there are certain conditions that bring to this thing to be chosen as the option, this thing of war, let's say, to be chosen as the best option, let's say, and it's decided, this still derives from an extremely complicated set of relations that have not really to do with the dichotomy, okay, let's use violence and let's not use violence. As a matter of fact, they stem from an enormously complicated sky, of policy that constantly moves. By the way, here I think the choice of the constellations as a metaphor is also intended to be, in fact, in its movements, this kind of overlappings, and combinations, etc. That is that have to be taken into consideration, so that even for those who read war historically as something, we're just a bunch of primitive apes that are stupid and therefore kill each other. Well, it's not really like that. And it's not really like that simply because, in fact, as von Clausewitz shows in this paragraph, war is not instinctive. I mean, violence, enmity, conflict is, but war in itself is not. And war is thought through by the state, the policy, and it's historically waged with a probably one of the most recent directions that and guidance that other human activities may find. Exactly because of its imposant potential that is a very tough thing to handle. But at the same time, here there is always also this kind of different measure, different potential, the varying potential, let's say, for which you can use violence for, I don't know, simple incursion in some state, I don't know, violence as even, armed forces like a police gunning down an armed suspect in something like that is a relatively small use of violence that people are normally not really so upset by, to great wars, full-scale wars that are definitely world-changing events, and that in this sense are very meaningful for our existence in any way you want to think them, even if you disagree. So von Clausewitz is also starting from the premise that even if you don't want to be at war, you still might become it someday, right? And therefore, in order, if you want to hope at least to win, first of all, you have to know how things really work a little bit, so that even if you don't, and this is because he actually knows that human nature is inherently conflictual, is inherently driven by these passions and emotions and violence and aggressiveness, etc. That even the more convinced pacifist, under certain particular circumstances from which we are genetically programmed, can transform you in the most afraid, most ruthless assassin. So it's a killer, let's say better. So things, this happens. Wars happen. There is another phrase that happens in this sense, but things can go seriously wrong. They can get pretty messed up, and you should at least be aware that such things happen for a reason, at least, and not just blaming it on, I don't know, whichever curse you think that humanity has on it to deserve wars, and not understanding what war is. And this is very very important, because it doesn't actually there is effectively a curse in humanity in this sense. The inherent feeling of enmity and conflictuality is understood in this sense. Is something that exists basically in every civilization. Think about the original sin in the Bible, etc. But at a certain point there is and it's very distinctive, and that's why it's a original sin. That what also in the Bible practically means, that you can't escape from it. So it's simply the awareness that such elements cannot be erased from our genes, so that even what is seriously wrong with pacifism, or also from a strictly biological point of view, is that you don't really understand how you can be a pacifist if you are programmed genetically to be violent by nature. And you say, well, there is also reason. Yeah, okay, but we know that reason is just a tiny part of what we do, and how we do it, and what we do it for, fundamentally. But reason in this sense should be used not to say okay, well, all wars are bad because they inherently kill people. There are policies that kill way more than wars do, but nobody gives a damn, including pacifists, and especially pacifists, I would say. But I think it's very responsible for every individual to at least try to make a good use of his or her own reason, and to try to understand, in fact, war not as this black and white thing, but simply as, or at least not simply, but something, as a realization it's simple, but this should lead to something else. That is that war are way more complicated things that have to be studied and understood, and not really discussed like jokes and having this extremely superficial attitudes towards it for the sake of themselves at the end of the day, and fundamentally because of ignorance. Because I believe that if any person read the Vom Kriege, they wouldn't even actually read and understand. Hopefully, there wouldn't even be any need to explain such things. But unfortunately, we live in a world where people are way less interested in engaging themselves in complex intellectual systems like the one von Clausewitz, many other authors propose, and like this one, which is actually not an extremely complicated thing to understand. It's very complex. The Vom Kriege is very complex, and therefore the lack of ignorance, the lack of knowledge in this sense, and ignorance is even worse in this case, because it's not about the actual difficulty to understand such things, but the problem you don't even try to learn about them, or to know that they exist, or to read them to understand what they are. But just think of war as a consequence of many factors, many changing factors coming together at one time. It's extremely important, and it tells you, it empowers you in responsible ways. Because if you think that war at this point is not just something that happens because it has to, but because it stems from a combination of factors that actually belong to policy, so to something that is eminently human, and therefore corresponds heavily to people choices, etc. Well, this obviously makes you understand that it's that it's a very committing activity. I mean, it's extremely important to participate, or at least to try to understand why such things happen, because they're evidently caused by someone, at least. So it's particularly meaningful, especially today, where there is a lot of political deresponsabilization. Like, we only need things. We only have rights. Nobody has duties seemingly anymore. But whatever. And then what he goes on is, I'm trying to digress because this paragraph is otherwise too short. But it's it's the matter being discussed that obviously leads to such obvious and sometimes even banal considerations, but that you can't avoid to make. So he says, von Clausewitz goes on, he says, it is only if we understand by policy not a true appreciation of affairs in general, but the conventional conception of a cautious, subtle, also dishonest craftiness, averse from violence, that the latter kind of war may belong more to policy than the first. So here, this is a very important phrase that basically sums up also much of what we were telling before, especially about the harmful character nature of policy in itself. I mean, depending on its motives, its etc. So here politics is being defined as a craftiness. For Clausewitz has already used this kind of commercial metaphors for defining policy, right? It's like a trade. I want something, you want something. So we may both have something that interests the other. Let's make a deal. Policy is fundamentally about this. And also war stems from this, in the sense that if I have an overwhelming, physical superiority over you, and we live in the wild, there is no one who can basically control us, like a state or something, and you have a lot of things I want, and you don't want to give me, I may as well just take into consideration the option to beat the hell out of you, to take all you have. So this is in many ways what it is. But you realize, even in this example, that I'm not doing it for the sake of violent behavior. I'm doing it simply because of another reason that at this point has to do with this craft that is, by the way, very economically rooted, as you understand, especially in this case. So the decision of war also has to do with this appreciation of a deal. Let's say, is it worth it? This is particularly meaningful. Very often you can't say it until the war is over, basically. But it's still about the bet, about the wager in this sense. So what's this craftiness about? What is policy? It's here are a series of adjectives. Although I was reading here that von Clausewitz is not defining actually policy as the craftiness in itself, but actually the conventional conception of craftiness. So in other words, it's the same thing that we have just said, stressing, in fact, the importance of the conception. The way things are conventionally even thought, probably meaning that it's not a big deal how you really want to do it, but simply how you're used to think it through. And there's very natural approach that human mind has towards these deals. But here, the craftiness, and what is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of this paragraph, is characterized with these three adjectives. The first one is cautious, then the second is subtle, and the third, probably the best, dishonest. So cautious, subtle, and dishonest. Cautious stands, I believe, in here for obviously the normal caution you have every time you have to make a deal. You have to judge, to calculate, and this is the part of be prudent, be wise, and it probably has to do in Clausewitzian thought also in that and not just in it, but actually in the way we really behave. And this way of saying, okay, this tendency towards, staying away from danger, staying away from trouble, staying away also from the, immediate and excessive exertions of force that can go to spend time planning, right? Sometimes this transforms itself into laziness, into idleness. This is the human tendency to stay away from, especially the more you have and the more you're satisfied, the less you become hungry for something else. So that this is very meaningful because, by the way, it shows that human vitality is definitely fueled by having problems in some ways, and having to solve problems, the ability of solving problems that can be solved immediately. So this quotient, general quotient, okay, they have to stay sharp in general. The subtlety, so here the conception of the craft has to be subtle. So you have to think it through, in a way that is not banal, that is not gross, that is not rough. You have to be able to sharp your mind, right? And so to think at all the possible implications as possible, then this craft is also dishonest. And guess what? This is at least something probably most of the people would agree with, is that the policy is inherently dishonest in some way, or at least that his thinking is by itself to be unscrupulous. Unscrupulous, and this is not really bad. I mean, being dishonest doesn't necessarily. Obviously, honesty has to do with, in this case, not the dishonesty towards yourself, but the dishonesty towards your potential competitor. So this is not actually dishonesty in the it's a bit of a moral adjective, and a moralistic adjective, stressing that there is a fair way of doing things, and that policy automatically thinks beyond that. And it is true, because guess what? Policy, as von Clausewitz has said here, is basically just a masked, a reasonable entity, right? So we all have dishonest thoughts, and this is also unavoidable, because you can't do things, you can't solve problems if you don't find it also dishonest ways to solve them in some ways, thinking at all the possible options, because that's effectively what this is about. So dishonesty here is to be meant as unscrupulousness, so also being ruthless. We know that policy is by antonomasia that. Politicians normally thought to be scrupulous, and to be in this sense ruthless, etc. But it's also positive in itself. It's like a bit like the aggressiveness that you're required to. Hey, it's still a bit of a different thing, but it's like that. Aggressiveness mostly loaded with this kind of mostly negative meaning, right, and significance. But aggressiveness is actually healthy for in the right measure, of course, for a health, for a normal life. Actually, you can't solve problems if you are not aggressive in part, and so this unscrupulousness is necessary to think things through and to solve problems. So this doesn't mean that here we're talking about the conception of policy, not if policy in itself, but fundamentally the things that are thought by policy, and that must be, I would say, dishonest themselves. But unscrupulousness, and in this sense, is also means also being unprejudiced, unbiased. In other words, open-minded. And this is what you really need. This is what was the goddess of war in the Hellenic pantheon, Athena. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and guess what? She's also the goddess of war. Guess why? Because she's able to think things through. And when she clashes against Ares, that is the other god of war, but of primitive war, of animal-like war, of pure violence, etc., Athena always beats him pretty badly, and guess why? This is the same Clausewitzian concept. Policy, control. Athena is also obviously the goddess of political thinking, of rational political thinking. The Greeks had already figured it out at the time. Politics controls war. It beats it. It beats violence. In other words, intelligence by rule overwhelms violence. Beats violence, is superior to violence, in other words. And this is effectively what war stems from. This is probably one of the greatest thoughts ever imagined. The Greeks achieved that 2,500 years ago. Today there are still people thinking, oh, but war is bad, war is all about instinct and all this stuff. No, war is moved by things that are the closest to reason we have in our society. And people who just go there by instinct, by sheer stupid violence, and just a bunch of primitive monkeys who don't make use of reason. That is a gift we could make definitely better use of. This doesn't mean that war is right because it's used by wisdom. It has nothing to do with that, but it's still based on this political and reasonable calculation, right? So this is the most important thing to bear in mind. So dishonest not as a wholly negative adjective, but like, stating the possibility that you can do one thing, but you can also do other things. So just being aware, not passively or deterministically acting because of something else that has brought you there, but simply because you think it and you decide it and you choose to do it. Wars are chosen to be fought, right? Then of course it depends also on whom chooses them, but it can go also in the other sense, meaning that there are people who don't understand that may have to act in certain cases in order to think about World War II, think about Lord Chamberlain and all the problem of giving Czechoslovakia to the Nazis. At that point, Chamberlain was clapped as the great savior of world peace, etc. And then World War II breaks out. There are 60 million people killed. Evidently, at that point, there can be the reverse mistake. That is, you haven't acted. You haven't used the military instrument when it had to be used. And this can happen not just because there are people who say, okay, we don't have to use it, but because there is a natural predisposition, as von Clausewitz puts it, in the human nature to grow forgetful, to grow kind of superficial, to grow idling and lazy towards these topics, so that you don't even know what you're talking about. I think this is very fitting in our current society that is definitely very active in terms of we definitely make a lot of war in the way we may maybe obviously not like in the past, but we still doesn't seem that really military instruments are off the table, like they're used every time, every day. But what about the masses that that are represented by the governments that effectively enact those military actions? What do they know about them? What do they care? What do they understand? This is an interesting question. I think most people are distancing themselves from the idea that the military option, the violence exists, and that it's not a matter of saying, I don't care, I dedicate myself to a wholly intellectual life. That I can make an example of this. I personally, for instance, I don't consider myself an intellectual, chiefly for this reason, meaning that, first of all, I have kind of a more an instinctual than the reasonable tendency, but that's normal because all humans have tendentially more sympathy towards instincts than towards reason. In other words, more sympathies towards Ares than Athena. But it's full of people who believe that the world is purely intellectual. It's purely about, the world will be solved in its problems exclusively by intellectual activity. This is also false. I mean, intellectual activity is definitely very important, but there is a detachment of the intellectual activity from the reality of how things work, so that in these fields of humanities, etc., where I grew, let's say, universitarily speaking, etc., I realized that most of the people consider, there are also certain political orientations that definitely don't push for, don't look with particular sympathy at the military or at certain things, but that's maybe another, that's a virtually, not really influent, but, we can skip on that. But I tendentially think that humanity is all about amenities, like everything is cool, just read and we will never have to fight wars. This is one of the greatest delusions of our times, the idea that that humanity could be just a purely reasonable thing. Von Clausewitz showed us that this is absolutely not the case, especially in the in the 22nd paragraph that we have seen here. Is a fantastic anthropological introspection. It tells us, we will always be the way we are, and actually not just the 22nd paragraph now, but the Vom Kriege is about this. That is, okay, yes, reason is important, but you can't pretend that even theory encompasses only reason, because if you take if you deprive reason of any other factor, basically you don't have a real world. The real world functions also with these things, but this sometimes horrible, cruel, senseless things that happen, but at the same time, maybe you can try to understand why they happen if you really study them, and not if you get lost just into exclusively intellectual sides. And that's why, and I believe, in fact, that those environments from which also this strange anti-Clausewitzian ideologies stem from are actually probably the best recipe containers for, let's say, ingredient containers for breaking out further violence, actually, because they're ideological, they're undetached with reality, and that's what happens when you're undetached with reality. It's when it's like when the Soviets decided that they had to nationalize all industries because they were in love with the great myth of the statalization, etc. What happens is basically the whole Soviet Union starts starving to death, because guess what? Without competitiveness and free market, all this economy collapsed, and that's why Stalin eventually had to reverse to Trotsky's theories, for which he had actually exiled and eventually had him killed for. But that's why pure intellectualism, pure ideologism are the cancer of humanity. And that's why von Clausewitz brilliantly says, you can't think of theory without practice. It's fundamentally useless, and I would add even harmful, actually. And it's probably also some at a more strictly gnoseological level, one of the greatest problems that we have in real life, that we don't actually figure out things, but we try to do them anyway, because at a certain level of understanding with that's what you have to do if you want to live a functional life. Otherwise you would simply freeze and stop and not doing anything. That's why in the absolute in the abstract conception of war that von Clausewitz had presented, there would have not even been the reason for fighting, because everybody would have known basically what the relations of force were, and nobody therefore would have moved a finger for trying to reverse it, would have been frozen in this kind of thermic death. Von Clausewitz tells you, whether you like it or not, human life goes in completely different ways. It's not about all reason. We don't know most of the times what the hell is going on, and therefore we have to find certain systems to obviously, using reasons, trying to understand things scientifically, but also being aware that you have to rely also on other qualities that sometimes are even instinctual or emotional, that you have to be able to combine with reason, because otherwise you can't go anywhere. And this is what we all do, even if you don't accept it, but it's how our minds really work. So going on with the phrase that we were reading, it's the last one. Von Clausewitz defines policy, also as a craftiness intrinsically averse from violence. In other words, here averse from violence doesn't mean that doesn't want to use violence, but that it is as merely in the merely political sphere something that doesn't make use of violence, because in that sphere would be instead war. So in that politics uses war, but is not war. So in this sense, it's averse from violence, not in its aims, but in its, because war is it's potentially all the time one of its instruments, but it's still something intrinsically different that tries to solve the matter with all possible options, not just with violence. And violence then has its own domain, as we have seen as well, right? So this dualism is particularly important because it draws actually a pretty sharp separation between the world, the actions enacted with war, and the ones instead with violence, let's say, and the ones that try to solve it through other means, fundamentally. Now, you could argue that it's also theoretically difficult to understand when actually violence stops and what is violence, because here we're still, there is not a strict differentiation. It's obvious that if you can be violent in many ways, and there are people who are hypersensitive today towards these things, but at the same time, it's as if policy partly retained the aggressiveness, at least in its intents, that war has, and that, in other words, policy can achieve even way more brutal results than war, as a matter of fact. And it's pretty easy, and it happens all the time. Just think about the market. The market can effectively destroy an entire economies, can bring on the street millions of people. It can starve to death. It can cause lots of problems. It can actually intervene on policy itself. It can cause coups and revolutions, and we all know that. I mean, that's the history of the world. So this is just for saying that war is, it looks kind of cute in all its violence compared to all the extremely mean things that the policy, most of the times, does and keeps doing, even without any, sometimes it just happens. There are policies that, every policy is gonna damage someone and favor someone else. It was what we fundamentally think, even democracy, like, is this one. There is a majority that fundamentally, if not imposes, but at least deciding for someone that is the minority part, and therefore there is, you understand, here an attrition, a competition, an inherent conflict and enmity, even in politics in itself. So it doesn't take necessarily to shoot a pistol or to drop a bomb to do massive damages and to be violent, let's say, even in the mindset, really, in the mindset in itself. So that war can be seen in here also as an intensification or escalation of this aggressiveness that we have, that happens through that particular instrument. Just remember that war in this sense is, not every violence is every form of violence is war. War is something historically predetermined. It happens between a group of humans that are organized in a certain way, that have a sort of particular hierarchy, etc. And it starts from a certain time in history, or prehistory if you prefer, while violence can happen every way, in every way. It can happen on the street, it can happen in domestic violence, it can happen everywhere. So it's as if, and this is pretty meaningful, because it makes you realize that it doesn't take war just to have mass killings, right? And that's why another reason not for not being a pacifist in this sense, but not even a militarist for that matter, but just to try to think objectively. Yeah. Then it says the latter kind of war may belong more to policy than the first. Yeah, so that von Clausewitz restates that, of course, there are wars in which this is more or less evident, right? So that there are wars in which also violence is kind of light, right? It happens. There are wars that you think about bloodbaths or resistance. Sometimes certain countries' occupations happen without much of a bloodshed. Sometimes it's extremely more. Of course, this has to do with the resistance from the other side. But just for saying that, even the intentions and the variations in the unleashment of force can be different from one side and the other, or whichever other side exists out there. Yeah, and this is it. So you understand, Clausewitzian thought is very linear. Doesn't require such an enormous effort to be understood. It's actually pretty crystalline, and you have just to think about it. It's in this sense, it's not easy. That's where the greatest difficulty actually stands. It's not really an extremely complicated mathematical problem to solve. It's really, trying to understand what you read, reflecting on it, trying to apply it to real examples, to your experience as well, and you will think it's okay. We lack just the last two paragraphs to complete the chapter, and then we will pass to chapter 2, end and means in war. And okay. And therefore, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.